So tonight's lesson, we're moving away from John. Well, sort of. We're moving away from only being in John, back to all four. And I guess this is the point where we'll be in all four Gospels pretty much for the remainder of the study. Matthew 26, 36 through 46, also Mark 14, Luke 22, and a few verses in John 18 are thrown in there. We're going to see Jesus in one of his deepest inward battle in this lesson. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we can maybe start by thinking of our own deep inward or inner battles that we've had over time. What they were, what was going on in our lives when we faced them, how we responded, who won the battle. Hopefully we did with God's help, but there may have been a battle or two in our lives and when we didn't win, that we were overcome. But in this lesson, that's exactly where we are, a crossroads of sorts in Jesus' life. Some consider it to be the greatest battle he ever had to face. As we see this, another of these images of Jesus' divinity and his humanity clashing. Not really clashing, maybe that's the wrong word, but a good balance we see in both. And usually every time we see him struggling in his humanness, his divinity shines even brighter. He overcomes in a great and marvelous way. So it's always countered by his deity. We see a side of him here that's not portrayed very often in the New Testament. Vulnerability. Of all the things we see, vulnerability is not one of the things that we normally think of with Jesus. He always seems to be on top of everything. You know, he answers things in the perfect way. He escapes when his life is in danger, before the time, of course. He always seems to know exactly how to handle every situation. And now we see a vulnerability that we don't normally get to see. So we read in Matthew 26, verse 30, that they are going on to the Mount of Olives. Actually, they sung a hymn first. Just sort of a detail that's thrown in there, and then we're not told anything about it. After they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus was soon to be betrayed. Remember, Judas had already left. He was going to find a way, a moment, the opportune time to betray Jesus, which really just means lead his enemies to him in a private setting where there's no crowd. And yet here, Jesus is on his way to the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and then he's going to go with only 3 of them. So Jesus and 3 other men. There's no better time for them to strike than now. And it was this very time, getting ahead of ourselves in our study overall, but this is the very time that Judas's behind the scenes, they're practically on their way to meet Jesus at this Garden of Gethsemane. So we'll start by reading verses 36 through 46 in Matthew 26. So 26, 36, 46. Here we go. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So Gethsemane is the location where they are, the setting. Traditionally, it is about half a mile, less than half a mile from Jerusalem, directly east of what's called the Golden Gate. It has been described as a walled garden, about 70 yards square. Has about 75 gnarled olive trees. Apparently the word Gethsemane means oil press, and it may be that there was an oil press there that was used in the harvest of olive trees, and those olives are why it's called the Mount of Olives. Pretty good name for it, I'd say. So, the garden, in a more spiritual sense, we see it as sort of an arena of a great conflict for Jesus. This is I use the word vulnerable. This is, whatever it is, it's the most we've ever seen Jesus up to this point. The text says that he began to be sorrowful and troubled. This is one of the few times, I think in one of our recent lessons, we pointed out that there's 3 different times when the Scripture says he was troubled, and this is one of them. He began to be sorrowful and troubled, and then he said, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He walks a little farther. He falls down and starts praying. And he begins the prayer with some words that we may think that he's used many times, but apparently this is the first time and the only time that Jesus uses this exact phrase, my Father. My Father, in this way at least. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. One of the most quoted, maybe most preached about, referenced statements that the Lord ever made. So this conflict, this garden was a place of distress. He was very distressed, about as distressed as he's ever been. He took Peter, James, and John. They are the sons of Zebedee. He wanted them to watch with him. It's a strange word, isn't it? To watch. Anybody say something different than that? Remain here. It's verse 38. I got a footnote, but I didn't think to look if any other versions actually have something different in the text. Okay. Keep awake. That's what my footnote says. Quite a bit different than watch. And I mean, in a way, obviously, when you think about somebody who's keeping watch, what sets them apart from everybody else? They're awake. That is the same thing. I mean, in that sense, it's the same. So that sort of puts into perspective the fact that they're asleep. When he looks up, or when he goes back over there to them, they're not keeping awake, but they are, and therefore they're not watching, but they're asleep. Now, they're not needing to watch necessarily the way a soldier would need to watch, although there were going to be some people coming, but they weren't going to They weren't supposed to resist those people anyway. So watching, he wanted them to be there with him and maybe sort of keep an eye out while he was praying. And he goes and he prays, and he has this request. And there's been so much speculation and discussion about what he's asking. What is Jesus asking? If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. The most common view is that the cup is the same thing that he's referred to in the past as the cup, which is his death that's about to happen. And that's very possible, if not likely. It could be the extreme physical travail that he's in view of that death. Either way, the only difference it makes is the way that the prayer was answered. And there's a powerful lesson in either case that we'll see. Yeah, Joe?
I think this is a picture and word of how horrible sin is to the Lord and to His Father and the Holy Ghost. I mean, death means a separation, and it meant that He would have to be separated from the Father. And sin is horrible to Him. And He's going to have to take the sins of the world on His shoulders. We take sin as a mistake. We think it's just, okay, so I didn't obey this time, but next time. But to our God, it's horrible. And it cannot be in His presence.
I mean, yeah, look at sin is the reason he's in this position. If it wasn't for sin, there would not need to be a sacrifice for sins.
It's also a depiction of free will, because He says, not my will, but thine be done. So it's total subjection.
Yes, he has that request. It's conditional. But I thought it was a good point that was made. I guess it was probably Alfred Edersheim, who said not only was, his request was subject not only to the Father's will, as he said, but also his own will, that the Father's will would be done. So it wasn't that their wills were in conflict necessarily, but Jesus' will was ultimately that his Father's will be done. So he's bringing, there may have been a struggle of sorts, but he's bringing his will into submission, perfect uniformity with the Father's. Not that he was ever truly considering violating the Father's will, but he was going to do it either way, but it's deeper than that. He's bringing his will into submission and unison with the Father's will. And that may be indicated with the fact that if you notice the second time he prays, it's a little bit different. Just ever so slightly, it's different. The first time, it's a positive thing, if it be possible. Positive in the sense of not having a negative word in it, like not. But the second time he says, in verse 42, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, so be it. So it's a little bit different. Maybe the first time it's more of, if this is something that is possible, like he says, then that's one thing. But then by the time he prays it again, it's almost like he's come to grips with the fact that it's not possible. So he says, if it's not, okay. Just a tiny bit different, maybe in spirit or maybe in progress. Mm-hmm.
When Jesus prayed and He talked to the Father talked to Him. But there's back responding to him. Do you know what I'm saying?
And I don't know
If God did say, it's got to be done. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we don't really know how that works. I mean, obviously, there is the possibility that the Father could communicate with him differently than he does when we pray. God's not going to give us a sign, or, make the lights flicker, to show us that he heard. We just know and trust and understand that he does hear. But at the same time, he may not have given any sort of direct response in his consciousness or whatever. And I don't see any indication that he did. In fact, I don't really see any indication that he ever did, except times whenever he answered from heaven, on those couple of occasions. But
the sin had already been placed upon him, and God couldn't.
well, I personally, I think that we might make too much of that concept of him taking on sin.
Becoming sin.
Yeah, and I blame preachers, honestly. Maybe trying to make too much out of what it means that Jesus became sin. Paul mentioned, 2 Corinthians 5 or so, that he made him to be sin. It seems to me to be an expression for taking on the punishment for sin. So it's almost as if God was he was punishing sin in the person of Jesus. I don't think there was any actual thing that happened that Jesus became sin, or that he took sin on himself in any actual sense that Jesus could have perceived or felt. And I read, at least in one commentary, that made that point, that Jesus wasn't afraid to die. He was God's people had been killed before in excruciating and horrifying ways. But what was giving him so much trouble, so as to fall on his face and pray and keep praying it, and then, as we're going to see, bleeding somehow, sweating drops of blood, was that he was going to become sin. And I don't buy it, at the moment, at least. If I see something more convincing, I'm fully prepared to change that. But he took on sin in the sense of the punishment for sin was put on him. And it's maybe just a figurative expression and not anything that actually happened that he felt or could perceive or that he was distressed about, because I don't even know how that would be something that could happen for somebody to take on sin in a way that they can tell that the sin of the world is on them. In a figurative way, sure, because the reason he was going to be nailed to that cross was because of how, like you said, how horrible sin is. If that just shows how horrible sin is, because he had to suffer that in order to.
But he was treated like a sinner.
Yeah, he was put there with sinners. He was paying the price for sins because he didn't deserve it, but he took it on himself. And that's what he's doing here. He's reining in his own will. We know that Jesus was 100% man. One of the great temptations that the devil presented to him was this very idea of the cup passing from him. When he talks about giving him all the kingdoms in the world, that's sort of the underlying idea there is, in my plan, there's no cross. And you can have not just one kingdom, you can have all the kingdoms in the whole world. And yet, he knew that, no, that will not stand. And now he's getting so close to the point. He's feeling it. As any of us, how could he not? He knows what's about to happen. And not that he was afraid to die, but we're not just talking about dying here. We're talking about dying in the most horrific and painful way anybody could ever imagine. Mm-hmm.
Then you're saying you don't think he was ever separated from God?
I don't think so. Not in what way would we say that he was separated?
He had to be in the tomb for 3 days.
Actually does, yeah. Like
Yeah.
actually dead for 3 days.
But no one ever, his soul had been fixed, and he commended his spirit to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Wouldn't his spirit be the same place anybody's spirit would be when they die? Or would it
Well, we know where it was. He said where it was going to go. It was in paradise.
Yeah, so he wouldn't be separated there.
Yeah, well, of course, there's the infamous
finding
cry of the from the cross. What the 7 things he said. One of them was, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is a direct quote of Psalm 22, verse 1. So, again, I think too much emphasis has been placed on what that could mean, and if he really had forsaken him. And, we sing songs about it, where he turned his back and all that. All that is just poetic references to Jesus on the cross that's not based in Scripture. It's just based in us trying to envision the whole scene on the cross. As far as the Gospels are concerned, it's just him quoting that psalm. But as far as God turning his back and all that stuff, that's just something that somebody made up. Not that it's wrong, but it is something that somebody made up. Debbie? I made you forget. I went on too long.
I mean, he was the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
He was the sacrifice for everyone that ever lived or would live. But I always thought that at the time of death, I thought he was alone. The apostles scattered, and I always thought that God turned his back upon him as he was the sacrifice for the sins. But now I see that's probably not.
Well, that is, like I said, it's not that that's some awful thing to believe, to think. And it very well could be the case.
He's also 100% God himself. I don't see how God would really separate from himself necessarily. I don't know.
Well, there's the Father and the Son.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. Well, Jesus was about as alone.
Yeah,
He was more alone than he had ever been, for sure, in his life. He felt. We can't get into his mind, so we don't know what he was thinking when he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" But
then he said, it's finished.
yeah,
Whatever happened at that point, it had been done.
mm-hmm.
But the
Yep.
picture of it blackened and the temple curtain being torn in two is and an earthquake. The earth moved.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody said, surely this.
Yeah, it showed. It was something for people to. Their attention would have been. They would have got their attention with those things happening. This is weird. That's happening. This is not usual. People are crucified all the time, but this doesn't happen. When they are. And what are the odds that this darkness happened and all this stuff? All this stuff we're talking about, I know in one way we're getting ahead of ourselves. In another way, this is probably all the things that Jesus is dealing with right here. He knows that this is what's coming. Now the time has come. Anything that we've ever dreaded in our lives, we can deal with it. No matter how horrible or much we dread it, we can deal with it. But the closer we get, it all of a sudden, it hits us hard. And especially, the night before, and you might not sleep, you're distressed, it's really taking a toll on you. Here it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. But in his case, there was. He could have said, no, change my mind. Sorry, I did my best. I tried. But I've decided I don't really want to save man that much. I don't deserve that cross. And maybe we can start over and I can go back up to heaven, and we'll get our heads together and figure something out and do it. We'll get something else figured out, Maybe, I hadn't been up there in a while, so maybe the Father's figured something out. We thought this was the way, but there's another way. I can't help but think these are the kinds of thoughts that could have been entering his mind because he was a man. And otherwise, I don't see what could have been leading him to ask or to even suggest this, if it's possible. No matter what the cup is, unless it's simply this pain he's feeling, this, help me get over this struggle. But like I said, most believe that he's talking about the death itself. Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, this is where the pictures in Revelation help me to see and feel a little more when the devastation of the angels and everybody when they're looking through heaven, trying to find somebody who can save the world. How the song that we sang that Wayne always likes, without him, how horrible it was for everyone until they found the Lamb worthy.
Yeah, nobody could open that scroll.
Except the worthy Lamb.
And he said everybody was, he himself, he broke down and he was having a vision, John was. So, what did it mean to him really? But he understood this was a horrible turn of events that nobody's able to open this scroll. But then that lamb, he saw a lamb that was slain. He's worthy. And that's the idea. There's nobody in heaven or on earth or under the earth that is able, worthy, but he could. And thankfully for us, he would. He wasn't just one who could, because once you find, you just take anything, who's able to do this thing nobody in the world's found, but we found one person who's able, then you got a 50-50 chance that they are willing to do it, even if they're able. But Jesus was. And the only reason he was is because of his love for us. So John 3:16 applies not just to the Father, but to Jesus also, because he was willing. And that's why I like to emphasize back in Abraham, in Genesis 22, Abraham and Isaac, and how Isaac was this was just a picture of what we're getting into here. Isaac wasn't a little blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby, as he's often pictured in, the kids' stories or whatever. He was probably a teenager, so there was a level of willingness on his part, and that just even further reflects the picture that it's previewing of Jesus' willingness to be the sacrifice. He wasn't just willing to let the Father drag him into this. He was doing it himself, which he's already said. I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to accomplish.
It's hard for us to even fathom because 99.9% of the time whenever we suffer or endure pain or are in a situation that's terrifying like surgery, it's not optional really. It's not something that we can really back out of, like childbirth. You can't really be like, okay, no, never mind, I don't want to do this. Like, you have to do it. So, and it's really hard to even imagine being in a situation where it's really off, like you really can be like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore, and still choosing to do it anyway, because we very rarely are in that situation, Like, we get through it, but we didn't really have much of an option.
Yeah, and in a time when that is even a relevant or applicable situation, it's good to have people, if you're in the moment where you might back out, to have people to help you, no, just, you can do it, push through, you can do this. About the only thing that I can even think of that is remotely comparable is a woman giving birth and wants to have a natural birth. It's hard for women to give natural birth, I think, anymore, because they know all they got to do is say the word, and they're going to get the shot that's going to numb them all up, and that's so easy I know I would do that. You know, I would go into it saying, no way, I'm not getting a shot. No way, I'm doing this the old-fashioned way. And as soon as it happens, I'm going to say, give me the shot right now. This is as far as I'm going. But if you have people there that are helping you, or maybe somebody's going to donate an organ or something, a kidney or something to somebody, and they get, you know, they're approaching the operating room, and it's like, okay, never mind, sorry, I can't do this. No, come on, you can do this. We've come this far. And here, Jesus walks over, and his disciples are asleep. He doesn't have anybody with him. Mm-hmm.
But you know, in those times when a person is suffering, and I have seen it, if someone, a loved one is nearby that loves them, it hurts the person watching more than it does the person suffering. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard a parent say, I would rather it be me. You know, I'll do it. You hear that, so you know that God hurt to have to require it of his son. So they were both very loving at that point.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, to hear your son begging 3 times, saying, but there's no other way.
Yeah.
I like that part in the picture. I know it's a movie, but when the teardrop comes down, you forget the emotion.
It's impossible for us to understand the relationship between two deities, or I mean, we know they're one, but they're two persons. None of us can even begin to understand that. It doesn't make any sense to us because we don't even know, we can't even understand one, you know, divine person. We know that Jesus wasn't really God's son, you know, but that relation, we understand that. We understand father-son, or mother-daughter for that matter. It's the same thing, or father-daughter, or mother-son, you know. Father-son relationship is something we can understand. And there is nobody, pretty much, there's nobody that a man would rather not see suffer than his son. So that's the whole idea, one of the ideas of the father-son picture. Another one is submission, of course. You know, he's subject to the father in the same way that an actual son is to his father. So we often overlook the other side of it. You know, we think about Jesus suffering, but what about the Father? It's not like he was would be okay. It's like a father and a son. So the apostles are not able to stay awake, and we can't help but cut them some slack because they had to have been exhausted. I mean, so exhausted, they're asleep. It's middle of the night, for one thing. I mean, that's when people are normally asleep. And we get the idea that they probably didn't have a whole lot of peaceful, normal nights of sleep. Never at home, hardly. I mean, even when they did get to sleep, it was away and, you know, traveling and all this. And we all know that there's a difference between the rest we get away from home and the rest we get when we are at home. So Jesus wasn't too hard on them, but he does challenge them a little bit. And he says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's a perfect picture of what Paul talked about in Romans 7 when he talked about that battle within. You know, I want to do this, but I end up doing that. And I don't want to do this, but I end up doing that. That's spirit is willing, flesh is weak. Doesn't make an excuse for the flesh, but it does reflect that inner battle that people have. So he was deserted. He was disappointed in them. He was deserted already in a way by them, not the way he would be. But finally he said, he prayed again. Then he comes back, they're asleep again. He goes back saying the same words again for the third time. But saying the same words, a repetition is not a vain repetition. Jesus condemned vain repetitions and empty phrases, but a repetition is not necessarily a vain repetition when it comes from the heart. That's what determines whether it's vain. But it wasn't just an area or arena of conflict. There's more to it, and we'll just run right through this. We've touched on most of it anyway. It's a place of supplications, and that's why Jesus went there. It was a place of submission as he's reining in his will to be in perfect unison, not harmony, but unison with the Father's will. Jesus won a great victory here in this garden. He was going to win the ultimate victory on the cross, but He's already won this great victory. You think about the devil and how much effort he put into thwarting God's purpose. He tried to kill the Savior before he was, when he was a child. Failed. He tried to prevent him ever being born. He failed at that. He tried to kill him when he was a little child. Failed at that. So Kaufman made the great point. He said there remained pretty much for the devil only two means of victory. One was that he would cause Jesus to sin. He's been trying that for 33 years now. And the other is that he might somehow induce Jesus to refuse to go to the cross. And that, I can't help but think, we see that at work right here still. Because he did have free will, and he had every right. It would not have been wrong for Jesus to not go to the cross. It wouldn't have been a sin for Jesus to not go to the cross. He could choose that. He didn't have any obligation to come to the earth in the first place. So if the devil could just convince him not to go, he can't get him to sin. He couldn't kill him. He can't get him to sin. Kill him, as a child before he became who he was. But if he could just get inside his head to get him to back out. So he exhausted every diabolical scheme he could possibly muster to get to ruin God's purpose. So this is why this is such an important crossroads. Would he, instead of endure it, would he renounce his mission? He's as close as he'll ever get to that, and we know that he didn't really get that close because he was going to do whatever the Father's will was, and he knew what the Father's will was, and he's going to get his help. And just as we close here, this is why it's encouraging what we see in the answering of the prayer. In one sense, we could say God did not give him what he asked for. That's if he's asking for the death to pass from him, the cross. But if he was asking for the strength to bear it, or this inner turmoil that he was feeling, then the prayer was answered exactly, because we read that angels came and strengthened him. Just want to make one point. When we read a passage like that angels came and strengthened him, I guess that's not in Matthew's account. The natural thing that we are going to think in our minds is that they actually showed up and Jesus saw them and they had a little chat, Oh, hey, Gabriel, how are things been? Michael and Gabriel, here they are. And Jesus is talking to them and they're, I don't know what they're doing. They're holding on to his arms or something, and, divine strength is emanating from them into him. But it doesn't give any indication whatsoever that Jesus even saw these angels, that he was, his senses were perceiving them, other than maybe some divine sort of knowledge. My point is, what God did for Jesus in the garden, he could still do today. Just because angels are doing something doesn't mean we know they're doing something. We're told that angels minister to those who are to inherit salvation. That's what their whole purpose of existence is to this day. We just don't know when they're doing things. And that takes us back to Elisha and his servant. Open his eyes and he sees this whole army of angels. Nobody would have ever known those angels were there if Elisha hadn't said, will you open his eyes so he can see? And he opened his eyes and he saw them. All he knew was they got more soldiers than we do and we're doomed. And Elisha said, no, we're not. We got more than they do. Look. And then he saw. And the history books, the Old Testament would have just recorded a victory against all odds with no mention of angels if it wasn't for that. And yet those angels are the reason they won that battle. So God can give us strength in ways that we cannot comprehend. And He gave Jesus strength. He strengthened Him. And that strength that He received, He went from being so, greatly or very sorrowful, even unto death, to being, we see Him back to Himself as what we think of as Himself. He's collected, He's resolved, He's ready to go. All of a sudden, He's ready. And he was the victor there because he prayed to His Father and he was strengthened. Also, just make one little note of the fact that it's very interesting that Dr. Luke is the only one that records the sweat like great drops of blood. Whether that means literally they were drops of blood or something else, it was the medical doctor that it was the one that recorded it, and that is not coincidence, I don't think. Wasn't Matthew the Jewish tax collector that had all these religious superstitions or anything like that. It was the Greek medical physician that recorded that Jesus sweat drops like great drops of blood. That's a significant factor. I always like it when Luke is the only one that recorded things, because he's the one that comes from such a different background. And when Luke records Jesus raising somebody from the dead, it means something, maybe a tad bit more than if Luke wasn't who he was. And the same thing with something like this, a medical anomaly. Luke is the one that recorded it. Matthew, Mark, John, they don't even mention it, but the doctor did. So, pretty powerful stuff. I've never been that distressed. I've been pretty distressed in my life. I've never sweat like great drops of blood. Sometimes my armpits sweat so much that I think they're like great drops of blood, but I've never actually done that. So, he was in a lot of distress and pain, but his Father was going to help him through. And he would need that help because everybody else was about to leave him. Thoughts? Comments? Last thing he says is, "Here comes my betrayer." And that's when things start to get a little chaotic in the camp of Jesus. We'll see that, Lord willing, Wednesday night, though. So the next time you're in a situation where you feel like Jesus did on this occasion, and you're in so much pain and stress, and you feel like nobody's ever suffered half as much as you're suffering right now, take Jesus' example. Pray, submit, and you'll find strength in that. I'm very confident that you will. I don't know how God will give you that strength, but He gave it to Jesus in a mysterious way, and He can give it to us in a mysterious way.